Hey, it's Shadow ACS again. So, following up from my last review, I'm continuing my .hack marathon by taking a look at .hack Liminality. Now, one thing I have to bring up when talking about this one is how and why it was released. Liminality was a 4-episode OVA that was released alongside the original run of .hack video games, beginning with .hack Infection. Basically, the story is about the events in the real world which run concurrently with the video game storyline which takes place in the virtual world. There were 4 games in the original .hack series, and each time one would be released, it would come packaged with an episode of .hack Liminality. The point I'm trying to emphasize here is that Liminality probably was not intended to be viewed as a standalone work, but rather it's meant to be taken in context alongside the storyline of the games. Which makes things on my end a little tricky, as I never really played any of the .hack games. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to watch all 4 episodes of .hack Liminality and take a look at how it holds up purely as a standalone work. After all, the story in .hack Sign was mostly intended to just be a preview for the upcoming games, and yet it still held up really well as its own story. So I'm going to see if Liminality works the same way. And I know it's entirely possible your experience with this show might be totally different if you play the video games along with each episode, but as far as a review I can actually put together goes, this is the best I can do for now. So let's take a look at .hack Liminality. Perhaps the most ironically disappointing thing about .hack Liminality is that when I first started watching it, I actually thought it was going to be better than the original show. The first episode of this OVA is really good. They set up an interesting main character, some good side characters, and a really good mystery. When it was over, I wanted to see where the story was going. Well, then episode 2 started, and then it became a lot more clear what they were actually trying to do with this. You see, this show actually has 3 different main characters, and each of the first 3 episodes focuses on a different one. Which isn't an idea that necessarily can't work. I mean, you have shows like Baccano, which have a ton of different main characters, and they still work fine. But with this story, I felt like it would have been a lot more focused if they had just kept to one scenario and maybe put the other 2 off to the side. But maybe I'm rushing things. Let's really take a look at it. The show begins with a girl named Mai, who was just hospitalized after playing the infamous video game known as The World. Apparently, Mai ran into an incident within the game that caused her and her boyfriend, who was showing her how to play, to go into a coma. While Mai was fortunately able to recover after only a couple days, her boyfriend sadly still hasn't woken up. At first, nobody really takes the idea that a video game is causing this seriously. That is until a man named Mr. Tokuoka approaches Mai and tells her that he used to work for the company that made The World. Apparently, Mai's boyfriend is not an isolated case, and several other people have also fallen into comas while playing the game. And the company that makes the game is trying to cover the whole thing up, leaving the coma victims to die. So Mai and Mr. Tokuoka decide to team up to try and solve this mystery themselves. So from the outset, the premise sounds really interesting and original. The episode ends on a great scene with Mr. Tokuoka nearly going into a coma himself and Mai narrowly saving him at the last minute. Then in a flare of passion we've never really seen her have before, Mai says this isn't over yet. Well, then episode 2 begins, which is about a totally different girl named Yuki. And keep in mind, I was already kinda disappointed by this because I wanted to see more of Mai. I thought she was a great character. But she and Mr. Tokuoka are barely in this episode. Most of the episode is about Yuki getting trapped in this mall due to a huge power outage, which I assume is related to events in the second game because the show never references it again. And Yuki teams up with this woman and the two have to try and escape the mall, and yeah, taken out of context it works okay, but here's the problem. This has nothing to do with what they were setting up previously in the story. We're not learning anything about the coma victims here, it's just Yuki trying to get out of this mall. And nothing she does to do that ever comes into play later, so it's all just a huge waste of time. While there are 1 or 2 scenes of Mai doing research on the coma victims, shouldn't that be like the majority of the episode? Hell, the only connection Yuki herself has to the first episode is that she briefly showed up on a passing email they saw. When the episode started and Tokuoka and Mai were talking about going up to meet with her, I didn't know who the fuck this character was. I actually had to pause the video and go to Wikipedia to see what the hell I missed. That's pretty damn sloppy. The third episode is about a new girl named Kyoko, and it does get a little more back on track about explaining the mystery and the coma victims and so on. It has them walking around this town that has a lot of rich history to it and explaining and learning about the backstory of the world, its creator, and so on. While I do like that this does explain some of the missing information we didn't get in the original .hack anime, it also kinda has the same problem as some of the talkier parts in the original .hack, in that it's just kind of confusing and not that interesting. This is why we have the show don't tell principle in screenwriting. It's much more engaging to the audience if you can say what you need to say visually or somehow work it into the story as opposed to just having two characters tell it to us. Granted, they do try to have a little more going on by having this hacker contact them and making them go from location to location solving different puzzles. And I like the direction they're trying to go with it. As Toko puts it, it's like an RPG game where you have to complete one objective and then move on to the next. But you're still basically just watching two people walk around a small town feeding the audience exposition. Maybe it would work a bit better if there were a few more interesting character moments between the two, you know, like fun quips to show off their personalities and how they work off each other, but there really aren't. By the time the 4th episode started, I had mostly lost track of what was supposed to be happening. I mean, I get that the idea is that they have to break into this corporation and hack the game directly through the main server or something, but that's as far as I got. How this was actually supposed to save the coma victims, I couldn't follow. And this is the one part where I think it might make more sense if you play the games all the way through, which, like I said, I haven't yet. I just remember a lot of techno-babble and I guess what was supposed to be suspense with the security guards coming in about to stop them. But to be fair, I had a hard time following the climax in the original Dot Hack as well, and yet there was still some really great memorable stuff I got out of it. I remember Tsukasa getting captured by the evil AI and all the other characters trying to find him. I remember the net slum area that all the hackers used with all the junky corrupt data. I remember that weird trippy area where all the characters started seeing evil clones of each other and they had to figure out who was the real one. And the show ended on an absolutely perfect note, with Tsukasa waking up and finally getting reunited with Subaru in the real world. It's just the most wonderful happy ending you want to see after all they've been through. Liminality just ends on a scene of all the characters meeting up and saying, hey, let's go get dinner together. Okay, they got dinner together. I guess I'm happy they got to eat some good food, but how does this wrap up anything? In fact, do we even find out if the coma victims woke up or not? I assume that's made clear if you play the games because that's what the whole plot is about. But shouldn't we at least see Mai reuniting with her boyfriend? Isn't that what started all of this? Okay, so the story is a confusing clusterfuck and doesn't really work. Is there anything about Liminality that does make it worth watching? Well, like the original Dot Hack, it is very good at creating strong, fleshed-out characters with distinct personalities. Especially in the first episode with Mai. You learn a lot about her in the short amount of time they have to convey this information. Her personality is made very clear. She's quiet, shy, subdued, and doesn't really stand out in a crowd. She likes to play the violin, has kind of a strained relationship with her family. You really feel like you get to know her as a person. Which is why it especially sucks when you watch the rest of the show and find out all these details they were building up about her don't amount to anything. Like, I like this childhood friend of hers who's kinda nerdy and has a crush on her and wants to do his best to help her out. But we never see him again after the first episode. The other two girls aren't bad, they're just not quite as strong. But again, they do have very clear personalities. Yuki is a bit of a sass, and Toko is an intelligent bookwormy type. But the big disadvantage this show has compared to the original Dot Hack in this regard is that it's only a 4-episode OVA. The original gave us over 20 episodes to get to know those characters and spend time with them. So of course this cast isn't going to be as memorable. It's almost not even a fair comparison. Although I will say that the one thing I think Liminality does better than Sign is the artistic presentation. If you recall, one of the complaints I had with Sign was that the animation and the backgrounds really weren't all that impressive. And while Liminality doesn't look amazing, it does feel like they've improved in that regard. The lighting's a bit more cinematic, the backgrounds are more detailed, and it has a terrific soundtrack. In fact, I dare even say their portrayal of modern-day Japan looks better than the game world did in the original. But does Dot Hack Liminality hold up as a standalone work if you haven't played the games? Not really. I'd actually be really interested in hearing the perspective of someone who did play the games and watched each episode as they came out. Would it make the story easier to understand? Would the characters be more engaging? Or would it still just be a confusing mess that doesn't really conclude that cleanly? Either way, what I can definitely say is that if you haven't played the games, you probably don't need to watch this one. If you haven't seen any of the other Dot Hack shows or played the games, this is a terrible introduction to the franchise. And if you've only seen Sign, I'd say check this one out only if you're curious to see it. At its worst, it's just kind of harmlessly bad. And even bad might be too strong a word, it's just not very engaging. But maybe you'll see it and get more out of it than I did. It's certainly better than that thing I have to look at next time. Oh god, here we go. This is Shadow ACS, and I'll see you next time.